The Middle Ages were an era defined by war. From the mist-shrouded forests of Germany to the sun-scorched plains of Spain, from the highlands of Scotland to the vast steppes of Eastern Europe, armies clashed in endless struggles for land, faith, and power. Castles rose like stone giants, their walls daring attackers to try their strength. Knights thundered across fields in gleaming armor, their banners whipping in the wind, symbols of honor, lineage, and vengeance. It was a world where conflict was constant, and survival often meant more than courage. It meant adapting to the weapons that shaped the battlefield. But not all weapons were created equal. Some were mere tools of destruction, forgotten as quickly as they were forged. Others, however, were revelations, technologies that overturned centuries of tradition, that forced kings and generals to rethink everything they knew about war. These were the weapons that changed not only how battles were fought, but how societies lived, prayed, and ruled. They turned peasants into powers, humbled kings, and even brought down the seemingly eternal walls of stone fortresses. To understand the Middle Ages, you cannot only look at crowns, treaties, or dynasties. You must look at the steel blade gripped in a knight's fist, the bowstring drawn by a peasant's calloused fingers, the counterweight trebuchet swinging its massive arm against the sky. Weapons were not background details. They were the engines of history. Each innovation was a challenge to the established order, and each left scars across Europe that endured for centuries. Consider the longbow, a simple length of yew wood that could cut through armor from hundreds of yards away. With it, English peasants brought French nobility to their knees. Or the crossbow, so deadly and easy to use that popes declared it unfit for Christians, fearing its power to erase the distinction between knight and commoner. The sword, meanwhile, was more than a weapon. It was a holy symbol, wielded with oaths and blessings, an extension of a man's soul. The lance gave the knight his terrifying thunder, the irresistible charge that crushed infantry beneath hooves and steel. The trebuchet hurled boulders like thunderbolts, shaking the very foundations of castles and cities. And then, in the later centuries, came the whisper of gunpowder, the first cannons that shattered walls and declared, with smoke and fire, that the medieval world was coming to an end. Each of these weapons did more than kill. They reshaped society. They shifted the balance of power between noble and peasant, between fortress and field army, between king and rebel. They forced rulers to build new defenses, to raise new kinds of armies, to abandon old strategies, and embrace the brutal reality of innovation. This is the story of 7 weapons that transformed the Middle Ages forever. Weapons that tore through armor, toppled castles, and broke the pride of knights. Weapons that defined the clash between tradition and change. Weapons that proved, time and again, that no matter how strong the walls, no matter how noble the blood, steel, stone, and fire, would always decide the fate of kingdoms. And so let us step into the battlefield. The air is thick with smoke. The cries of men rise with the ringing of steel. 1,000 lives hang in the balance, and history itself is about to turn, not because of kings or crowns, but because of the weapons in their hands. In the rolling green hills of England, a simple weapon of yew wood changed the destiny of nations. It was no glittering sword, no ornate relic blessed by priests, but a bow taller than a man, drawn with the strength of his whole body. The longbow was as unassuming as it was deadly, a peasant's tool that humbled the pride of knights and carved its place in history through blood and triumph. The longbow was not born of luxury, but of necessity. English yeomen, trained from boyhood to hunt and survive, grew up with the bow as an extension of their arm. By law, Practice with the bow was encouraged, even required for the defense of the realm. This meant that when war came, England could call upon thousands of skilled archers, not professional knights but common men, bound together by discipline and practice. Their weapon was crude compared to a knight's sword, but in the right hands, it became the great equalizer. The genius of the longbow lay in its power and speed. With a draw weight of over 100 pounds, it could send an arrow screaming across a battlefield, piercing chainmail and sometimes even plate armor. But more than that, its rate of fire was unmatched. A trained archer could loose 6, even 10 arrows in a minute, a storm of death that rained down upon cavalry and infantry alike. Against this, no shining armor, no noble blood could guarantee survival. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 revealed its terror to the world. French knights, proud in their armor, thundered across the field in waves. They expected to scatter peasants with a single charge. Instead, they met a hail of arrows that fell like a black storm, cutting down men and horses before they ever reached the English line. At Crécy, and later at Agincourt in 1415, the longbow turned the tide of history. Thousands of French nobles lay broken in the mud, their valor undone not by sword-to-sword combat, but by shafts of wood launched from the hands of farmers. Agincourt stands as the longbow's finest hour. Outnumbered and surrounded, King Henry V's army faced annihilation. But the English archers, standing shoulder to shoulder in the rain-soaked fields, unleashed devastation. Mud bogged down French cavalry, and arrows cut them down before they could strike. The might of France crumbled before men armed not with lances or cannons, but with bows carved from yew. It was the triumph of discipline, practice, and innovation over tradition and pride. The longbow did more than win battles. It transformed society. It proved that the strength of a nation did not lie only in its knights and nobles, but in the arms of common men. It democratized the battlefield, giving peasants the power to shape history. A knight might train for decades to master sword and lance, but a peasant archer could bring him down with a single arrow. The longbow was, in truth, the weapon that shifted the balance of medieval warfare, weakening the monopoly of the nobility on violence. Yet the longbow demanded sacrifice. Its use required years of training, and archers bore the marks of their craft. Enlarged shoulders, deformed spines, fingers hardened from the bowstring. Their lives were shaped by war, their skills both a gift and a curse. And when battle ended, they often returned not as heroes, but as peasants again, their role in history fading into the shadows of lords and kings. Still, the longbow left a mark that could not be erased. It shattered the myth of invincible cavalry, challenged the supremacy of nobility, and gave rise to a new kind of army. Its arrows were not just weapons. They were symbols of change, of the common man's unexpected power. In the annals of medieval warfare, the longbow stands as the great equalizer, the peasant's deadly answer to the knight's pride. If the longbow was the weapon of patient practice and lifelong training, the crossbow was its brutal, efficient cousin. Where the longbow demanded years to master, the crossbow could be wielded by almost anyone with minimal instruction. Its design was deceptively simple: a short bow mounted on a wooden stock, with a trigger mechanism to release the bolt. But within that simplicity lay a power that struck terror into the hearts of knights and nobles alike. Unlike the longbow, which required immense strength and endurance, the crossbow stored its power in the mechanism itself. By winding back the string with a lever, crank, or even a belt hook, a soldier could load the weapon and hold it ready indefinitely, waiting for the perfect moment to fire. When released, the bolt flew with incredible force, short and heavy, capable of punching through armor at ranges where arrows would falter. A peasant with no lineage, No heraldry and no years of martial training could, with one well-aimed shot, fell a knight who represented generations of privilege. It was this leveling of the battlefield that made the crossbow infamous. The Pope himself, alarmed by its implications, declared at the Second Lateran Council in 1139 that the weapon was hateful to God and banned its use among Christians against one another. To the medieval mind, the crossbow was not only a weapon, but a moral threat, a violation of the codes of honor and combat that defined knightly warfare. Yet the ban proved futile. The crossbow's effectiveness was too great, and armies across Europe continued to employ it against both Christian and non-Christian foes. The psychological impact of the crossbow was profound. Knights who had once ridden into battle confident in their armor and their noble birthright now faced the constant possibility of death from a faceless soldier hidden behind a shield wall. Castles that had once seemed impenetrable found themselves vulnerable to volleys of bolts that could harass defenders and pick off leaders. Even in sieges, the crossbow was indispensable. Crossbowmen stationed atop battlements became guardians of the walls, their bolts raining down on any who dared approach. One of the most famous victims of the crossbow was King Richard the Lionheart of England, a monarch renowned for his martial skill and courage. In 1109, while besieging a castle in France, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt fired by a boy defending the walls. Though initially dismissing the wound as minor, infection set in, and the king died soon after. That a legendary warrior king could be undone not by a knight's lance in glorious combat, but by a single bolt from an untrained hand underscored the crossbow's terrifying power. But if the crossbow inspired fear, it also reshaped strategy. Armies learned to protect their soldiers with large pavises, towering shields behind which crossbowmen could reload safely. Mercenary crossbow companies became highly sought after, particularly in Italy and France, where their discipline and firepower could turn the tide of battle. Warfare became less about individual valor and more about coordinated volleys and formations, a step toward the organized militaries of the future. The weapon also reshaped the relationship between rulers and the common people. With a crossbow, a king could arm his peasants and field a deadly force without the slow, expensive process of training longbowmen. But this empowerment of ordinary men came at a cost. The nobility could no longer claim a monopoly on battlefield dominance. The crossbow democratized killing power, making war bloodier, less predictable, and more devastating. In the end, the crossbow's legacy was one of disruption. It eroded the ideals of knightly combat, undermined the social hierarchy of the battlefield, and set the stage for the rise of gunpowder weapons. It was feared, despised, and condemned, yet it could not be stopped. The crossbow was the weapon that whispered a new truth across the fields of Europe, that no armor was absolute, and no man, king or knight, was beyond the reach of death. No weapon carries as much myth, reverence, and symbolic weight as the sword. In the Middle Ages, it was more than a blade. It was a badge of honor, a vessel of faith, a sacred inheritance passed down through generations. To be girded with a sword was not merely to be armed. It was to be marked as a warrior, a knight, a defender of Christendom. Where the longbow and crossbow unsettled the social order, the sword preserved it, embodying the very spirit of the age. The medieval sword came in many forms, each suited to its time and place. The arming sword, with its straight double-edged blade and cruciform hilt, was the classic weapon of the knight, balanced for both cutting and thrusting. Its shape echoed the Christian cross, a constant reminder that the knight's duty was bound to faith as much as to feudal lord. Later, the long sword, longer, heavier, demanding 2 hands to wield effectively, became the weapon of choice for battlefield and duel alike, allowing both sweeping cuts and devastating thrusts. The falchion, with its single-edged, curved blade, offered raw, cutting power. Its brutal edge favored by soldiers less concerned with elegance than efficiency. But the sword was never just steel. It was a story. Swords were given names: Durandal, Joyeuse, Excalibur, imbuing them with personalities, destinies, and legends. They were blessed in churches, carried into battle as relics, kissed before combat, and sometimes buried with their owners, as though a knight could not stand before God without his faithful blade. To lose one's sword in battle was humiliation. To break one's sword was tragedy. On the battlefield, the sword was both practical and symbolic. In the crush of combat, where arrows had already flown and lances had shattered, the sword became the weapon of last resort, the tool of close struggle. Its edges met not only armor, but flesh. Its point slipped into gaps at visor or joint. It was intimate, brutal, a weapon that demanded proximity and courage. Unlike the distant hail of arrows or the anonymous power of siege engines, the sword was personal. It forced men to look into the eyes of those they killed. Yet the sword's significance reached beyond war. It was a tool of justice, used in executions to behead traitors and criminals, its edge a reminder of the law's sharp finality. It was a symbol in ceremonies: a knight dubbed with a sword across his shoulders, a king crowned with a sword at his side, a noble sworn in with a sword in hand. In art and literature, the sword was the emblem of virtue, courage, and divine authority, shining as brightly in romances as it did in chronicles. The rise of other weapons, bows, crossbows, and later gunpowder, challenged the sword's supremacy in practical terms, but its symbolic hold was never broken. Even when muskets lined the fields and cannons roared against castle walls, the sword remained at the side of commanders and nobles, a reminder that honor could not be measured only in firepower. The sword persisted, not as the most efficient weapon, but as the most enduring emblem of what it meant to fight and to lead. To hold a sword in the Middle Ages was to carry more than iron. It was to bear a legacy, to embody the ideals of knighthood, to shoulder the weight of faith and duty. Even today, centuries after the clangor of swords has faded from the battlefield, they endure in memory, legend, and symbol. For the medieval world, the sword was reality and dream, flesh and spirit, steel and story, all forged into one. There was no sound in the Middle Ages more terrifying than the thunder of hooves, a rhythm like distant drums that grew louder with every heartbeat. From behind banners snapping in the wind came the armored knights, their steeds covered in caparisons, their bodies encased in steel, and in their hands, lances leveled like a forest of death. Few forces in history inspired such awe and dread as the medieval cavalry charge, and at the heart of that spectacle was the lance. Unlike the sword, the lance was not meant for prolonged combat. It was a weapon of shock and momentum, designed for a single, devastating strike. Fashioned from ash or pine, often more than 3 meters long, tipped with a steel head, the lance was an extension of the knight's charge. When lowered underarm and couched tightly against the body, it transformed horse and rider into a missile of flesh and iron. Entire infantry lines could be broken by the sheer impact of dozens or even hundreds of lances striking as one. The rise of the lance made the knight the undisputed master of medieval battlefields for centuries. Infantry, unless deeply disciplined and shielded by pikes or fortifications, often stood no chance against the charging tide of armored horsemen. Chronicles tell of entire armies scattering before the sight of an advancing cavalry charge, the psychological effect nearly as devastating as the physical. To face the knight's charge was to face not only the enemy's steel, but the crushing weight of social order itself, for the knight embodied nobility, chivalry, and divine sanction. The tactic reached its apogee during the Crusades, where the knightly charge became a weapon of both faith and terror. On the plains of the Holy Land, Christian cavalry smashed into Muslim lines with thunderous force, banners emblazoned with crosses leading the way. At battles like Arsuf in 1191, Richard the Lionheart's disciplined knights broke through Saladin's ranks, demonstrating the devastating potential of well-timed charges. The lance was not just a tool of war, it was the spearhead of Christendom's military might. But the lance was not only for the battlefield, it became the centerpiece of the tournament, where knights tested their skill and courage in jousts. Two riders galloping full tilt at one another, lances poised, aiming to shatter their weapon upon an opponent's shield or helm, created both sport and spectacle. These tournaments were more than entertainment. They were rituals of status, where victory brought glory, and a broken lance became a mark of honor. The joust ensured that even off the battlefield, the lance remained a symbol of knightly identity. Yet the supremacy of the lance had limits. At battles such as Bannockburn in 1314, Scottish infantry bristling with long pikes stopped English knights dead in their tracks, proving that discipline could blunt the terror of cavalry. Over time, as crossbows, longbows, and eventually gunpowder weapons spread across Europe, the knight's charge became less decisive. The lance, once the weapon of dominance, faced the grim reality of obsolescence. Still, in its prime, the lance embodied the spirit of medieval warfare. Swift, violent, overwhelming, it was the weapon of the mounted elite, a symbol of nobility's might over the common soldier. To hear the thunder of a knightly charge was to feel history bearing down upon you, a storm of flesh and steel that few could withstand. The lance remains etched in memory, not just as a weapon, but as an image of the Middle Ages itself. When we think of knights, we imagine them with lances lowered, banners flying, horses galloping headlong into destiny. It was a weapon that defined an era, and though it was eventually surpassed, its legacy endures in the myth and majesty of the knight. If the lance was the weapon of knights on open fields, then the trebuchet was the weapon that humbled kings within their castles. Towering above siege camps, with great wooden arms and counterweights heavy as boulders, the trebuchet was not merely a machine of war, it was a declaration. To build one outside an enemy's walls was to announce, "Your stone stronghold is not eternal, your sanctuary is not safe." The genius of the trebuchet lay in its counterweight. Earlier engines, onagers and mangonels, relied on twisted ropes or manpower, but the trebuchet used gravity itself. A massive weight, swung down by a carefully engineered mechanism, launched stones weighing hundreds of pounds with astonishing accuracy. The sight was awe-inspiring, a great arm creaking backward, the sling tightening, and then, with a thunderous crash, a boulder hurled through the sky like the fist of God. Castles that had once seemed invincible now shuddered under the trebuchet's assault. Its stones smashed towers, splintered gates, and sent defenders scrambling. At Acre in 1191, during the Third Crusade, trebuchets hurled destruction day after day against walls, shaking the morale of those within. In the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, Edward IV of England unveiled the most famous trebuchet of all, Warwolf. It was so massive that the Scots besieged inside offered to surrender rather than face it. Edward, relishing the spectacle, refused their plea until Warwolf had hurled its first stones, reducing walls to rubble and reminding all who watched of England's might. But the trebuchet did more than break walls. It broke spirits. The psychological impact of seeing stones the size of men hurtling through the air cannot be overstated. Defenders knew that no matter how high their walls, the enemy outside could reach them. Some armies even loaded their trebuchets with grotesque projectiles, rotting carcasses, diseased animals, or severed heads, to spread terror and plague among those trapped within. War was not only about killing, it was about eroding hope. The construction of a trebuchet itself was a feat of engineering and organization. Entire forests were felled to provide the beams. Whole teams of carpenters and engineers labored for weeks to raise the machine. To build one was to invest in the promise of victory, and its very presence outside a castle was as much a threat as its projectiles. Siege warfare became as much about patience and engineering as about valor with sword and shield. And yet, the trebuchet was more than a weapon of brute force. It was a symbol of ingenuity, of humanity's ability to harness natural forces for destruction. Gravity, silent, invisible, inevitable, was transformed into thunderous violence. The trebuchet represented the growing sophistication of medieval warfare, where engineering and mathematics began to rival courage and strength as the deciding factors in war. As gunpowder spread through Europe in the later Middle Ages, trebuchets gradually disappeared. Cannons could be built smaller, moved more easily, and fired with even greater power. But in their time, trebuchets reigned supreme. They were the kings of the siege, the giant hammers that shattered stone and spirit alike. To stand on a castle wall and watch a trebuchet's arm swing, the counterweight fall, and the great stone rise into the sky must have been to feel helplessness creep into the bones. The weapon did not come with banners or trumpets, but with inevitability. Each impact was a drumbeat of doom, telling defenders that their time was measured not in years or months, but in the number of stones left in the enemy's camp. The trebuchet was more than a machine. It was the thunder of the Middle Ages, the wrath of kings made manifest in wood, rope, and stone. In the waning centuries of the Middle Ages, a new sound rose above the clash of swords and the thunder of hooves. A deafening crack, a burst of smoke, the roar of powder ignited. It was the sound of gunpowder, a force that would shatter not only stone walls, but the very foundations of medieval warfare, where once castles had stood unassailable and knights had ridden as lords of the battlefield. The cannon announced that the old world was crumbling. Gunpowder came to Europe from the east. Its earliest traces carried along trade routes from China through the Islamic world. At first, it was treated almost as alchemy, mysterious, unpredictable, a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur that could summon thunder from the earth itself. But quickly, it was put to use in war. Crude hand cannons and early bombards appeared in the 14th century, noisy, unreliable, and often as dangerous to their users as to the enemy. Yet even these primitive weapons terrified opponents, for they brought a chaos no sword or spear could match. The real revolution came with the great bombards, massive cannons forged from iron or bronze, capable of hurling stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. At the Siege of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II unleashed the monstrous cannon known as the basilica, a weapon so vast that it required hundreds of oxen and men to move. Its thunder shook the earth, and its projectiles tore through the legendary walls of the Byzantine capital, ending 1,000 years of history in a matter of weeks. That single event declared to the world that no fortress, however ancient, could withstand the fury of gunpowder. For knights, too, gunpowder was a death knell. The armor that had once made them nearly invincible became a burden against bullets and shot. No breastplate, however thick, could guarantee safety from the new weapons. Cavalry charges that had once broken infantry lines with ease now faltered before disciplined ranks of men armed with arquebuses and, later, muskets. The knight, once the apex predator of the battlefield, became an endangered relic in the face of fire and lead. The spread of gunpowder weapons also transformed the very shape of warfare. Castles gave way to star forts, low and angled, designed to absorb cannon fire. Battles became contests of artillery, sieges dominated by the thunder of cannon rather than the swing of trebuchets. The battlefield grew louder, deadlier, more impersonal. Where once valor had been measured by lance and sword, now victory belonged to those with the most powder, the best engineers, the strongest cannon. Yet the transition was not immediate. For a time, swords and guns, knights and cannons coexisted in a strange, uneasy balance. But the direction was inevitable. Each new cannon cast was another nail in the coffin of the old order. By the end of the 15th century, gunpowder had remade war entirely, and the Middle Ages gave way to a new age of empires, exploration, and conquest, all carried on the back of cannon fire. The arrival of gunpowder marked not just the end of medieval warfare, but the end of medieval imagination. Where once knights had dreamed of glory in single combat, rulers now dreamed of cities flattened, of kingdoms subdued not by chivalry, but by firepower. It was a shift as profound as the invention of writing, or the rise of agriculture, a change that altered not just how men fought, but how they thought about power itself. And so, with the roar of cannons and the smoke of muskets, the Middle Ages ended. The lance splintered, the trebuchet fell silent, the longbow and crossbow were cast aside. Gunpowder had declared a new age, the age of fire and empire. Amid the thunder of cannons and the flight of arrows, there remained one weapon that never lost its place on the battlefield or in the shadowed alleys of medieval cities: the dagger. Small, silent, and intimate, the dagger was the weapon of last resort, the blade drawn when all else had failed. But it was also far more, an instrument of mercy, of assassination, of survival. If the sword was the emblem of knightly honor, the dagger was the reminder that war and life alike often ended in the grip of something far humbler. Daggers took many forms, but perhaps the most infamous was the misericord, literally, the mercy giver. This long, slender blade was designed not for slashing, but for thrusting into the gaps of armor. In the chaos of battle, when knights lay sprawled in the mud, trapped beneath the weight of shattered armor and broken horses, it was the misericord that finished the fight. To some, it was an act of compassion, a swift end to suffering. To others, it was ruthlessness, a way to ensure the enemy never rose again. Either way, the dagger earned its grim name by deciding fates in moments where chivalry had no place. Beyond the battlefield, daggers were constant companions. Nobles carried ornate blades at their belts, symbols of status as well as tools of defense. Merchants, pilgrims, and peasants alike carried simpler versions, for in the uncertainty of medieval life, to be unarmed was to be vulnerable. In crowded markets, darkened taverns, or lonely roads, a dagger could mean the difference between life and death. The dagger also became the weapon of intrigue. In courts and cloisters, where whispers carried more weight than banners, assassins struck with daggers hidden beneath cloaks. Kings and lords often feared not the knight charging across the field, but the servant at their side, the courtier who approached too closely. History is littered with moments where thrones were overturned not by armies, but by the thrust of a concealed blade. In combat schools, the dagger had its own discipline. Manuals from German masters like Johannes Lichtenauer and Italian teachers like Fiore de Liberi detail elaborate techniques of grappling, disarming, and thrusting. In close quarters, where swords were too long to maneuver, the dagger became the weapon of skill, where survival depended on speed, precision, and nerve. Its versatility was unmatched. Soldiers used daggers not only to kill, but to cut ropes, skin game, or carve wood. It was the universal companion, a blade that never left a man's side, even when armor and lances were set aside. In this way, the dagger bridged the gap between war and daily life, between battlefield and hearth. Yet the intimacy of the dagger also made it uniquely feared. To kill with a sword or lance was to strike at distance, often lost in the tumult of battle. To kill with a dagger was to look into the eyes of the dying, to feel the resistance of flesh and armor. It demanded proximity, and that proximity made it both brutal and personal. Few weapons spoke more clearly of the raw, unvarnished reality of medieval violence. Though overshadowed in memory by grander weapons, the shining swords, the thundering trebuchets, the roaring cannons, the dagger endured in quiet persistence. It was the blade of mercy, of treachery, of survival. In every era of the Middle Ages, it played its part, reminding all who lived and fought that sometimes history turned not on the clash of armies, but on the silent thrust of a small blade in the dark. Weapons do more than shape battlefields. They reshape societies. Each innovation in medieval arms carried consequences far beyond the clash of steel, seeping into the structures of power, the balance between classes, and even the imagination of an age. The 7 weapons we have explored were not merely tools of killing. They were instruments of transformation, turning the medieval world on its head in ways that kings and commoners alike could scarcely foresee. The longbow was the first true challenger to aristocratic dominance. For centuries, knights had ruled the battlefield, their armor and horses making them nearly untouchable. But the bow, wielded by peasants, made mockery of noble privilege. At Crécy and Agincourt, the flower of French chivalry fell not to lances or swords, but to shafts of yew loosed by men of no title. This shifted the meaning of power, no longer rooted solely in bloodline, but increasingly in discipline, training, and national will. The crossbow carried this even further. Its ease of use empowered rulers to raise armies from ordinary men with little training. But it also terrified the nobility, for their armor and lineage no longer guaranteed safety. The Pope's attempt to ban it was not just a spiritual decree, it was a cry from the old order, desperate to preserve its monopoly on violence. Yet the weapon spread, and with it, the seeds of social leveling were sown. The sword, though, resisted this tide of change. It remained the most potent symbol of hierarchy and faith, wielded in battle, court, and ceremony. To be knighted was to be given a sword. To rule was to bear one at one's side. Even as other weapons rose, the sword's symbolic supremacy ensured that the ideals of knighthood and nobility endured, though increasingly hollow against the realities of arrows and bolts. The lance and the cavalry charge reinforced the nobility's grip for centuries, embodying the spectacle of aristocratic dominance. Yet, as infantry armed with pikes and bows learned to resist the charge, the social authority of knights cracked. Warfare became less about the thunder of nobles and more about the massed discipline of common soldiers. Slowly, the myth of knightly invincibility dissolved, and with it, the unquestioned supremacy of the feudal order. Siege weapons like the trebuchet redefined not just warfare, but architecture and urban life. Castles, once symbols of permanence and divine protection, were revealed as vulnerable. Lords could no longer rule with impunity behind stone walls. As trebuchets, and later cannons, tore through fortresses, rulers were forced to centralize power, build new forms of defense, and reconsider the balance between offense and defense in a changing world. Gunpowder accelerated this shift to an almost unimaginable degree. With cannons, kings no longer relied as heavily on knights or barons. Gunpowder armies required money, engineers, and logistics, resources only centralized monarchies could command. The feudal patchwork of lords and vassals gave way to the beginnings of modern states, their authority rooted in the thunder of artillery. War was no longer the domain of noble households. It became the business of nations. And then, beneath all of this, lay the dagger. Silent, close, intimate, it was the great equalizer of moments. It reminded rulers that they were never entirely safe, no matter their armies or castles. It reinforced that power was always fragile, that even the mightiest king could be undone by a hidden blade. In this way, weapons redrew the medieval world. They shifted who held power, how battles were fought, and what societies believed about fate and authority. The bow humbled the knight. The crossbow frightened the church. The sword sanctified nobility. The lance embodied chivalry. The trebuchet humbled castles. Gunpowder erased them. And the dagger whispered in every corridor that history turns not only on armies, but on single moments of steel in the dark. Medieval society was built on hierarchy, faith, and tradition. But its weapons proved that no order is eternal. Each new invention rewrote the script of power, forcing kingdoms, armies, and peoples to adapt or to fall. In the echo of those weapons, we hear not just the clash of war, but the heartbeat of history itself. When we look back on the Middle Ages, we often imagine banners flying, knights charging, and castles standing proud against the horizon. But behind those images lies a truth both simple and profound. It was weapons that carved the destiny of an age. Each blade, bow, and engine of war left more than scars on the battlefield. It left marks upon society, culture, and the imagination of generations to come. The longbow transformed peasants into kingslayers, showing that even the humblest could alter history with skill and discipline. The crossbow unsettled the order of Christendom, its bolts piercing through not only armor, but also the fragile sense of noble invincibility. These were weapons that democratized death, opening battlefields to men who had once been excluded from the dance of power. The sword remained something more than steel. It was the ritual object, the relic of honor, the symbol of justice. Even as gunpowder rose and arrows flew, the sword's presence in ceremony ensured that the ideals of chivalry, however battered in practice, remained woven into the medieval mind. The knight's blade was as much a story as it was a weapon, and its story endures to this day. The lance embodied nobility's thunder, a weapon that, when couched beneath the arm of a knight, became unstoppable in its prime. Yet even the lance, once a spear of destiny, was eventually humbled by the discipline of infantry and the bite of steel points planted firmly in the earth. What was once awe-inspiring became obsolete, a reminder that even glory must bow to change. The trebuchet thundered against walls that had stood for centuries, tearing down not just towers but illusions of permanence. Castles, once thought unbreakable, fell under its stones, and with them fell the certainty of safety behind walls. Siege warfare revealed the truth of the age, that no fortress was eternal, no lord untouchable. The trebuchet taught kings that power demanded movement, adaptation, and the embrace of new ideas. Gunpowder brought the final, seismic shift. Its roar announced the twilight of the Middle Ages, sweeping away castles, knights, and feudal armies. Monarchs who mastered cannon and musket became rulers of nations, while those who clung to the old ways fell into ruin. It was fire that ended the world of iron, and from that fire rose the modern state. And then there was the dagger. Small, silent, but eternal. It whispered in shadows, reminded kings of their mortality, and played its part both on muddy fields and in gilded halls. In its intimacy, it showed that history is not only written by great engines of war, but also by the thrust of a single hand in the dark. Together, these 7 weapons tell us something essential: that technology is not neutral. It reshapes who holds power, who loses it, and what stories we tell about ourselves. The Middle Ages were not only an era of faith, feudalism, and tradition. They were an era of constant transformation, driven by the iron in men's hands and the fire they unleashed upon one another. And so, as we leave behind the clang of steel and the thunder of war machines, we recognize that these weapons did more than change how battles were fought. They changed how societies lived, how kings ruled, and how people imagined their place in the world. They were not just tools of death, but instruments of destiny. The legacy of iron and fire is this: that no age is eternal. Power shifts, orders collapse, and the tools we create to protect us often remake us in ways we cannot foresee. The Middle Ages ended in smoke and flame, but its weapons echo still, in our histories, in our myths, and in the eternal truth that every age is built not only on ideas, but on the steel and fire that defend or destroy them.